The diner smelled of stale coffee and impending violence. Leather-clad giants blocked the exits, their shadows swallowing a desperate father. As a switchblade gleamed under the flickering neon, a 7-year-old boy stepped directly into the line of fire. "Please," his trembling voice shattered the silence. "Don't hurt my dad." The Mojave Desert heat pressed against the glass of the Copper Kettle Diner like a physical weight. But Thomas Callahan was shivering. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-August, the kind of day where the asphalt on Route 66 turned to liquid and the horizon shimmered with mirages. Inside the diner, the air conditioning unit rattled and wheezed, fighting a losing battle against the California summer. Tommy sat in a cracked red vinyl booth near the back, his hands wrapped tight around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. Across from him, his 7-year-old son, Leo, was happily drowning a stack of buttermilk pancakes in maple syrup. Leo's legs swung beneath the table, too short to reach the checkerboard linoleum floor. He was wearing a faded graphic tee featuring his favorite cartoon astronauts, his blonde hair sticking up in cowlicks that refused to be tamed. He was the picture of innocent oblivion. Tommy, however, was a man watching his own execution clock tick down. His eyes constantly darted to the dirt parking lot outside, scanning the highway for the dust cloud he knew was coming. Tommy wasn't a criminal. He was a master mechanic, a man who had spent his life with grease beneath his fingernails, rebuilding transmissions and resurrecting classic engines in a small garage in Barstow. He was an honest man who had been broken by an agonizingly common tragedy. 2 years ago, his wife, Claire, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. The insurance company fought them on every experimental treatment, every out-of-network specialist, and every overnight hospital stay. Tommy had emptied their savings, sold their home, and moved himself and Leo into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above his auto shop. But the bills kept coming, and Claire kept fading. When the hospital threatened to discharge her due to lack of payment for a life-extending trial drug, Tommy did what any desperate husband and father would do. He found money in the shadows. He borrowed $30,000 from a man named Declan Walsh. Declan wasn't a bank. He was the vice president of the Iron Hounds Motorcycle Club, a notorious syndicate that ran the local supply lines, the underground poker games, and the predatory loan operations that preyed on the desperate. Declan had smiled a shark's smile when he handed Tommy the duffel bag of cash in the alley behind the garage. "No rush on the principal, Tommy boy," Declan had rasped, clapping him on the shoulder. "Just make the vig every month, $5 grand. Keep us happy, we keep you happy." Claire passed away 6 months later, holding Tommy's hand, completely unaware of the deal her husband had made with the devil. Since then, Tommy had worked himself to the bone, 80-hour weeks, taking on every salvage job and engine rebuild he could find. But $5,000 a month in pure interest was a mountain he couldn't climb. 3 weeks ago, he missed his first payment. A week ago, he missed the grace period. Yesterday, he found a dead crow nailed to the front door of his garage, a thick iron nail driven straight through the bird's skull. The message was clear. "Dad?" Tommy flinched, pulling his gaze away from the window. Leo was looking at him, a forkful of syrupy pancake hovering near his mouth. The boy's bright blue eyes, Claire's eyes, were wide with concern. "You're sweating, Dad. Are you hot? You want my water?" Leo pushed his condensation-beaded glass across the laminated table. Tommy forced a smile, swallowing the lump of pure terror lodged in his throat. "I'm okay, buddy. Just thinking about work. Eat up. We'll go to the park after this, okay? Feed the ducks. Can we get ice cream, too?" "Yeah, Leo, we can get ice cream." Tommy looked down at his own trembling hands. He had exactly $300 in his wallet. It was everything he had to his name. He had come to the diner because it was a public place, hoping that if Declan found him here, the presence of witnesses, Brenda the waitress wiping down the counter, old man Henderson drinking soup in the corner, might prevent things from turning bloody. He just needed to beg for one more week. He had a custom 1969 Mustang restoration finishing up on Friday. He could pay them then. Suddenly, a low, guttural vibration rattled the silverware on the table. It started as a distant hum, a low-frequency rumble that vibrated through the soles of Tommy's boots. Within seconds, the hum grew into a deafening roar. The diner's large front windows began to shake in their frames. Leo paused, his fork dropping to his plate with a clatter. Whoa, motorcycles! Tommy's blood ran ice-cold. He looked out the window. Tearing off the highway and kicking up a massive cloud of yellow desert dust were 6 heavy Harley-Davidson choppers, their chrome exhaust pipes gleaming in the harsh afternoon sun. They moved in perfect, terrifying formation, pulling into the diner's lot and cutting their engines in unison. The silence that followed was worse than the roar. "Leo," Tommy whispered, his voice cracking, "I need you to slide over. Sit by the wall. Do not move from this booth. Do you understand?" "Dad, what's wrong?" Leo's voice pitched up, sensing the sudden, suffocating panic radiating from his father. "Nothing, buddy. Just sit back. Please." Through the glass, Tommy watched them dismount. The men wore heavy black leather cuts, the back patches proudly displaying the snarling metallic dog of the Iron Hounds MC. At the front of the pack was Declan Walsh, a wiry, jagged man with a scarred jawline and cold, reptilian eyes. But it was the man walking beside Declan that made Tommy's stomach completely drop out. It was Big John Lawson, the president of the Iron Hounds, a massive, towering wall of muscle and faded tattoos, with a thick greying beard and eyes that had seen, and likely ordered, unspeakable things. Big John rarely left the club's compound for collections. If the president was here, this wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was about making an example. The heavy glass door of the Copper Kettle Diner swung open, the cheerful jingle of the entry bell sounding like a death knell. The moment the Iron Hounds crossed the threshold, the diner died. Brenda, who had been pouring a fresh pot of decaf, froze mid-pour, the dark liquid pooling on the counter. Old man Henderson slowly lowered his spoon, his eyes glued to his bowl. The rhythmic rattle of the AC unit suddenly seemed deafening in the heavy, breathless silence that blanketed the room. Heavy leather boots thudded against the linoleum. 6 men spread out. 2 moved to block the front door, crossing their massive arms. 1 walked over to the jukebox, unplugging it with a violent yank. Declan, Big John, and a heavily tattooed enforcer named Silas Reynolds walked straight down the center aisle, their eyes locked on the red vinyl booth at the back. Tommy stood up. He didn't want them near Leo. He stepped out of the booth, placing his body squarely between the advancing bikers and his son. His knees felt like water, but he locked them, forcing himself to stand tall. "Declan," Tommy said, his voice tight but remarkably steady. "I have the money coming. Friday. The Mustang is done Friday." Declan stopped 3 feet away, a cruel, mocking smirk twisting his scarred face. He casually reached into the pocket of his denim vest and pulled out a heavy roll of quarters, tossing them up and catching them in his palm, a makeshift brass knuckle. Tommy, Declan tisked, shaking his head. "We had an agreement. We shook on it like men. And now you're avoiding my calls. You're hiding in diners. It's insulting, really." "I'm not hiding," Tommy said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm here. I'm telling you, to your face. Give me until Friday. 15,000, all of it. I'm selling the shop, Declan. I've got a buyer lined up. You'll get everything." Big John Lawson stood silently behind Declan, his thumbs hooked into his belt loops. He looked like a mountain, his face an unreadable mask of weathered stone. His cold, pale eyes drifted from Tommy's pale face down to the booth behind him, catching a glimpse of the small boy huddled against the wall. "You're selling the shop?" Declan laughed, a harsh, scraping sound. "That's real cute, Tommy. But the interest compounded yesterday. You don't owe me 30 anymore. With penalties, you're looking at 45. And my patience? That ran out when you didn't answer the door yesterday." Tommy's breath hitched. 45? Declan, that wasn't the deal. I only borrowed. Declan lunged. It was terrifyingly fast. Before Tommy could react, Declan's hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of Tommy's grease-stained work shirt. With a violent jerk, he slammed Tommy backward against the edge of the Formica table. Tommy grunted in pain as the hard plastic dug into his spine. Plates rattled, a glass of water tipped over, spilling cold liquid across the table. "Dad!" Leo screamed from the booth, his voice piercing the tense air. "Stay there, Leo!" Tommy gasped, struggling against Declan's iron grip. "Declan, please, my boy is right here. Let's take this outside, please." "Outside?" Declan sneered, leaning in close, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and peppermints. He pressed the heavy roll of quarters hard against Tommy's cheekbone. "No, I think we do this right here. I think you need to learn what happens when you disrespect the hounds. Silas, break his right hand. Let's see him fix a Mustang with shattered fingers." Silas, the massive enforcer, took a heavy step forward, his knuckles cracking as he pulled a heavy steel wrench from his belt. Tommy squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the agony, praying Leo wouldn't look. Then, a blur of motion darted from the booth. Leo didn't hide. He didn't cry in the corner. Driven by a desperate, instinctual love for his only remaining parent, the 7-year-old boy scrambled over the vinyl seat, his small sneakers hitting the floor. He rushed forward and wedged himself directly between the towering, tattooed mass of Silas Reynolds and his pinned father. Leo threw his arms open wide, forming a tiny, fragile barricade. He tilted his head back, staring straight up into Silas's hardened, scar-crossed face. His small chest heaved, his eyes brimming with tears he refused to let fall. "Please!" Leo's high, trembling voice rang out, echoing off the diner walls. "Please don't hurt my dad. He's a good dad. He's just trying to fix the cars. Please!" The room fell completely, utterly silent. Even the hum of the highway outside seemed to vanish. Silas froze, his heavy wrench suspended in midair. He looked down at the boy, a flash of genuine shock breaking through his intimidating scowl. Declan blinked, his grip on Tommy's shirt loosening just a fraction in sheer confusion. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the Copper Kettle Diner was the frantic, shallow breathing of a terrified 7-year-old boy willing to take a steel wrench for his father. Then, the silence was broken by a deep, resonant rumble. "Declan!" It was a single word, spoken softly, but it carried the weight of a falling anvil. Big John Lawson stepped around Silas. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that belied his massive size. He stopped right beside Declan, looking down at Leo. The imposing president stared at the boy's outstretched arms, at the tear tracks cutting through the dust on his cheeks, and then shifted his heavy gaze to Tommy, who was pale and shaking against the table. "Declan," Big John repeated, his voice ominously calm. "Let him go." Declan frowned, his bravado faltering for a second. "Boss, he's dodging. We gotta show him—" "I said," Big John interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, "let the man go." Reluctantly, Declan opened his fist. Tommy stumbled forward, gasping for air, immediately pulling Leo into his chest and wrapping his arms tightly around the boy. He buried his face in Leo's hair, shaking uncontrollably. Big John slowly lowered himself into a crouch, his massive leather-clad frame creaking. He was now eye level with the terrified father and son. He looked at Tommy's calloused, grease-stained hands, then at the terror in his eyes. "Son," Big John said, his voice surprisingly gentle, rumbling like distant thunder. "What's your name?" Thomas," Tommy stammered. "Thomas Callahan." Big John nodded slowly. "Thomas Callahan. Tell me something, Thomas. Why did you borrow $45,000 from the Iron Hounds?" Tommy swallowed hard. 30. I borrowed 30,000. The rest is interest, and I borrowed it for my wife, Claire, for her cancer treatments at Cedars-Sinai. But it wasn't enough. She passed away last year. A strange, heavy stillness settled over Big John. He didn't look at Tommy. He slowly turned his head, looking up at Declan, who suddenly looked incredibly pale. "Cancer treatments," Big John echoed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He stood up, towering over Declan. The atmosphere in the diner shifted from the threat of violence against Tommy to something far more dangerous, directed entirely inward. "Declan," Big John said, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "The club ledger says Thomas Callahan borrowed 10 grand for a gambling debt at 30%, not 30 grand for medical bills." Declan swallowed loudly, his eyes darting toward the exits. "John, listen, it's just a paperwork thing. I was gonna—" "The club," Big John continued, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet diner, "does not run predatory loans on grieving fathers. We do not bleed working men to bury their wives. That is street gang filth. That is not the Iron Hounds." The twist hit Tommy like a physical blow. The debt, the crushing, terrifying debt that had ruined his life, was a lie. Declan wasn't collecting for the club. He was using the club's muscle, their reputation, to run his own private, unsanctioned, loan-sharking operation, skimming the massive profits and hiding the reality from his own president. Big John looked back down at Leo, who was still clutching his father's shirt. The hardened biker reached out a massive, scarred hand and gently patted the boy on the shoulder. "You're a brave kid," Big John said softly. He looked at Tommy. "Your debt is clear, Thomas. Keep your shop. Buy your boy some ice cream." Big John turned his back on them, his massive frame radiating pure, suppressed fury as he grabbed Declan Walsh by the throat of his leather cut. "Now," Big John growled, dragging the sputtering vice president toward the diner door. "You and I are going to have a little club meeting." Through the dirt-streaked windows of the Copper Kettle Diner, Tommy watched the brutal mechanics of frontier justice unfold. The desert sun baked the asphalt, casting long, distorted shadows as Big John Lawson dragged Declan Walsh into the center of the parking lot. The remaining Iron Hounds followed in dead silence, forming a tight, inescapable circle around the two men. Inside the diner, Tommy sank back into the red vinyl booth, pulling Leo onto his lap. He buried his face in his son's small shoulder, his entire body trembling violently as the adrenaline that had kept him upright began to crash. He had prepared himself to die today. He had prepared himself to be beaten half to death while his son watched. The sheer whiplash of surviving left him completely hollowed out. "Dad," Leo whispered, his little hands patting Tommy's greasy back. "Are the bad men gone?" "Yeah, buddy," Tommy choked out, wiping his eyes with the back of a calloused hand. "They're not going to hurt us. We're safe." He looked up as a shadow fell across their table. Brenda, the waitress who had been working the counter, stood there. She was a hardened woman in her late 40s, her apron stained with cherry pie filling and coffee grounds. She didn't offer a platitude or a sympathetic smile. Instead, she set down a fresh plate of double fudge brownies and 2 tall glasses of cold milk. "Eat," Brenda said softly, sliding into the booth opposite them. She looked out the window, her eyes narrowing as she watched Big John towering over Declan. "You're Tommy, right? From the garage down on Elm?" Tommy nodded slowly. "Yes, Mum." I've seen Declan sniffing around here for months, running his own little side hustle, Brenda muttered, lighting a cigarette and blowing the smoke toward the rattling AC unit. He thinks he's sly. He thinks the patch on his back gives him a license to play God with people who are already drowning. Outside, Silas Reynolds stepped forward. Under Big John's sharp command, Silas grabbed the collar of Declan's heavy leather cut. With a violent, tearing motion that seemed to require an impossible amount of strength, Silas ripped the Iron Hound's president patch clean off Declan's chest, followed by the main rocker on his back. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, a man's cut was his identity, his armor, and his life. Stripping it in the dirt was a profound excommunication. Tommy winced as he watched Declan fall to his knees in the gravel, his face a mask of humiliated rage as the other bikers turned their backs on him. "Why did he stop?" Tommy asked, turning back to Brenda. "Big John. Why did he care about Claire's hospital bills? Declan had me dead to rights." Brenda took a long drag of her cigarette. "Because John Lawson isn't a street thug, Tommy. He's a former Force Recon Marine. He did 2 nightmare tours in Fallujah back in 2004 before he came back and took over the charter. He built this club on the idea of brotherhood, not bleeding the innocent. But more than that." She paused, her eyes softening as she looked at Leo, who was happily destroying a brownie. 10 years ago, John had a daughter," Brenda continued, her voice dropping to a low, painful whisper. "Her name was Sarah. She got sick, leukemia, just like your wife. John spent every dime he had, mortgaged the clubhouse, and moved heaven and earth to get her into the pediatric oncology ward at the Oceanside VIA Medical Center. He sat by her bed for 8 months, watching her slip away." Tommy felt a cold chill run down his spine. The sudden, terrifying empathy in Big John's eyes finally made sense. "When you mentioned the cancer treatments," Brenda said, crushing her cigarette into an aluminum ashtray, "you didn't just give an excuse, Tommy. You brought John back to the worst year of his life. And when he realized Declan was using the club's money to finance a predatory loan against a grieving father, well, you're watching the karma hit back right now." Tommy looked out the window again. The Iron Hounds were mounting their choppers. Big John stood by his massive customized Harley, looking down at Declan, who was still kneeling in the dirt, stripped of his colors and his protection. John kicked dirt onto Declan's boots, mounted his bike, and fired the engine. Within seconds, the deafening roar of the motorcycles filled the air once more. The pack pulled out onto Route 66, leaving Declan Walsh completely alone in the dust, a broken, exiled man. "You know," Brenda said quietly, sliding a piece of paper across the table toward Tommy, "I'm the one who made the call." Tommy stared at the paper. It was a receipt for the diner's payphone. "I saw Declan corner you in the alley behind the Wells Fargo last week," Brenda confessed. "I saw the terror on your face. I've known John since his Marine days. I called him yesterday and told him to look into Declan's private ledgers. I didn't know it would explode in my diner, but I knew John wouldn't stand for it." Tommy stared at the waitress, completely dumbfounded. This woman, a complete stranger pouring coffee for tips, had risked the wrath of a cartel to save his life. He reached across the table and grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight. "Thank you. God, Brenda, thank you." "Don't thank me," she smiled grimly. "Just finish that Mustang you were talking about, and take this boy to get some ice cream." 2 months bled into a crisp, golden Mojave October. The crushing weight of Declan's phantom debt was gone, replaced by the honest grease and sweat of Callahan's classic restorations. Tommy had poured his soul into the 1969 Mustang, finishing the flawless cherry-red rebuild 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The client, a Newport Beach real estate billionaire named Arthur Sterling, was so impressed he wired a $10,000 bonus directly into Tommy's account at Chase Bank. For the first time since Claire's passing at Cedars-Sinai, Tommy could finally breathe. He bought Leo a brand new Schwinn bicycle and even stopped by the Copper Kettle to leave a massive tip for Brenda, the hardened waitress who had risked everything to make that life-saving phone call to the club. But the desert, much like the ruthless syndicates that operated in its shadows, rarely forgave a debt. It was a late Friday night. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed over the garage as Tommy wiped down his tools. Leo was fast asleep in the apartment upstairs. The heavy steel roll-up door was locked tight against the autumn chill. Clatter. Tommy froze. The sharp metallic sound echoed from the darkened back office. He grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from the rack, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He crept toward the shadows, but he was too slow. A figure lunged from the darkness. A heavy hand grabbed Tommy's collar, shoving him violently against the cinder-block wall. The cold, unforgiving steel of a .45 caliber pistol pressed directly against the hollow of Tommy's throat. It was Declan Walsh. But the arrogant, leather-clad biker from the diner was gone. This Declan was a hollowed-out ghost. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. Stripped of his club patch, Declan had become a dead man walking. Word on the street was he owed $40,000 to the Navarro cartel for a bad methamphetamine deal, and his time was up. "Hello, Tommy," Declan rasped, his gun hand shaking violently. He smelled of cheap whiskey and pure desperation. "Heard you got paid today. Heard billionaire sterling lined your pockets. You're gonna open that safe, or I swear to God, I'll put a bullet in you and go upstairs for the kid." The threat against Leo didn't spark fear. It ignited a blinding, primal fury. Tommy braced his boots against the concrete, fully prepared to take the bullet if it meant getting his hands on Declan's throat. Before Tommy could move, the world exploded. The deafening screech of tearing metal drowned out Declan's heavy breathing as a reinforced black Ford, AF250, reversed straight through the corrugated steel garage door. The barrier crumpled like tin foil. Blinding halogen headlights flooded the bay. Declan whipped his head around, stumbling backward and lowering the gun in sheer panic. Through the settling dust stepped Big John Lawson and Silas Reynolds. They weren't wearing their biker cuts. They wore heavy canvas work coats, looking like modern-day mountain men descending from the high country to deliver frontier justice. Silas carried a short-barreled Remington shotgun, resting casually over his massive shoulder. Big John moved with the terrifying, calculated precision of a former Force Recon Marine. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He simply advanced. "I told you, Declan." Big John's voice boomed, carrying the absolute weight of an executioner. "If your shadow crossed this town again, I would bury you under it." "Stay back, John!" Declan shrieked, raising the .45 with trembling hands. "I'll shoot!" Silas didn't blink. The enforcer racked the shotgun and fired a single beanbag round. The heavy projectile struck Declan square in the sternum with the force of a sledgehammer. Declan flew backward, crashing hard into a stack of radial tires. The pistol clattered uselessly away. Silas was on him in a heartbeat, planting a heavy steel-toed boot hard onto Declan's wrist, pinning him to the floor. Hard karma had finally come to collect. Big John helped a gasping Tommy to his feet. "You all right, Thomas?" "Yeah," Tommy wheezed. "How did you know?" "A good commander never leaves a civilian flank exposed," Big John said quietly. "We knew he was desperate to pay the cartel. Silas has been sitting in that truck across the street every night since the diner. We protect our own." Red and blue lights flashed through the ruined doorway. Officer David Grisham of the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department stepped inside, having been tipped off by Big John minutes prior. He took one look at the scene, hauled the sobbing, ruined Declan to his feet, and slapped the heavy steel cuffs on his wrists. Armed robbery would put him away for decades. As the cruisers pulled away, taking the nightmare with them forever, Big John pressed a thick stack of $100 bills into Tommy's grease-stained hand. "For the door," the giant Marine rumbled gently, glancing up toward the apartment. "You raised that boy right, Thomas." Tommy stood in the cool October night, watching the taillights fade. The violent storm had finally passed, broken not by the law, but by a waitress's courage, a little boy's love, and the unyielding honor of a hardened soldier. Sometimes, profound miracles do not arrive on the wings of angels, but on the deafening roar of a motorcycle. A father's desperate love and a young boy's fearless courage shattered a ruthless extortion cycle. In the dusty Mojave heart, true justice was delivered not by the law, but by an unbreakable code of honor, proving that light can unexpectedly emerge from the absolute darkest and most terrifying of violent shadows.